Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the World Chess Championship 2021 between Magnus Carlsen and Jan Nepomniachtchi. It is the 10th game, and the score is 6 wins for Magnus, well, 6 points for Magnus, and 3 for Jan. Imagine 9 games, 6 wins, 3 wins for one side. I mean, and there's just no draws. No, it's 6 out of 9, which is a nice score, and 3 out of 9, which obviously not so nice. And Jan's clock is ticking. He has got the 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th game. He has 5 games to catch up and at least get 7 points to force a tiebreak. The question is it over, and what is going to be his strategy now that he has the black pieces against e4? So obviously Jan, when he needs to play for a win, he has played the French in the candidates, and he's also played the Sicilian defense. I mean, if you need to win a game of chess and your opponent plays e4, you probably go Sicilian, right? The thing is, Jan goes back to Petrov, and Magnus, like, he will just play into this because against the Petrov, if you really want to not lose, you really won't lose. As we saw 2 games ago when we had the variation after d4 on the board, which just led to like a super peculiar and symmetrical structure, which can also come out of the exchange French. It can also come out of the Berlin defense sometimes. But in this game, we have knight e5, so Magnus plays the classical main line, d6, and now, rather than retreating back to f3, he plays knight d3. Knight d3 is definitely a strange move. It kind of blocks everything and breaks all of the opening principles that you would teach a beginner. Like, for example, if one of my 6-year-old students back in the day played knight d3, I would have them evaluated and make sure that, they can continue in the tournament and give them a very stern talking to. But when Magnus plays knight d3, I'm like, yes, an unorthodox regrouping of the knight from the center of the board by the world champion. So it's one of these things. The point is that you're going to kind of put your knight on f4. And when this knight takes here, you're going to pin it to the king. Now, Magnus actually played knight d3 in the World Chess Championship 2018 against none other than Fabiano Caruana, and that was the only game in that match that he almost lost. In fact, he was losing, but he didn't. Knight takes e4, queen e2, queen e7. And this is how you're already seeing the potential drawing chances, right? You're going to get a queenless middle game, most likely, with just the imbalance in the pawn structure. The game between Magnus and Fabiano proceeded knight f4 looking for knight d5, knight c6 effectively ignoring knight d5, knight d5, knight d4 with 2 hanging queens, which looks really spicy but is completely not spicy. In that game we got takes, and then the knight drops back to d5 to target c7. The knight drops back to d4, targeting c2. White should not enter the variation where both sides lose their rooks. Instead, knight a3 was played in that game, and we had a queenless middle game fight. That's what we had. A horsey gala, if you will, with the horses sort of dancing around in the center of the board. But in this game, we got knight f4, and knight c6 is definitely a pretty provocative move, but here we get knight back to f6. So Jan, is not really interested. He just has the queens stare at each other. There's very awkward tension. It's like the kings were trying to get into the fight, but they realized that they were quite not athletic and had not practiced cardio in a while, put on some quarantine pounds, and so the queens had to step in and point some guns at each other. Wow, that is a very, very American way of describing a conflict. If British, it would be knives. Anyway, so queens staring at each other down the E line, and no one wants to budge. Magnus plays d4. He goes two squares in the center of the board. Not bad. Knight c3, maybe bishop e3 is coming. And here Jan plays a novelty. This move, according to the database, has never been played at master level. Online database, like I always check chess.com, I check Lichess. But it has been played online by people who are not as strong. The move knight c6, which we just looked at in a separate variation, but normally instead of knight c6, you have some trades, like you have queen e2, bishop e2, bishop f5. It's actually really fascinating. White wins like 75% of the time in these positions, because black gets total symmetry, but a move behind white always has the advantage of posing problems first. It's kind of just funny, when you have symmetry, but you have the disadvantage of having the move next after the person, you're not going to be very happy. So knight c6 attacks the pawn on d4, and you have the option here to play this move bishop e3. Now bishop e3 will just be, I mean, chess will get played. Like, there's no more queen trade. Probably white will try to castle long. Probably black will try to castle long. I don't see how you're going to achieve castling short unless you do it like this. And chess can be played. Magnus thinks for a while, and he chooses not to engage. He plays c3. And now queens most likely will be traded. But first, Jan plays d5. So Jan just spends an extra move with his pawn to take full control of the center. And tries to kind of mimic the pawn structure that white has, right? Jan here cannot get away with blocking the queen trade because he's just giving up the bishop pair for no good reason. So there's no reason to just give away bishop for knight like this. Jan could play g5. This is a very provocative and very spicy move, but I just don't really know if, like, I don't know if this is really worth it, you know, because now you just create a weakness. You could play rook g8. This was some Stockfish suggestion. It just looks absurd, but Stockfish is trying to do something, you know? Stockfish is trying to do something. It's programmed to do something. So d5, knight d2. Again, queens are just staring at each other. Like, you swing first. No, you swing first. You ever seen those, like, fight videos? That's, like, my guilty pleasure. Like, watching people on the internet get filmed beating each other up. Not like UFC, like, just in a grocery store. Because they look so funny. And I'm like, wow, this is like barbaric. It's like the caveman in me. So now it's like, yeah, you swing. No, you swing. The queens just can't decide who's going to throw the first punch. Obviously, the other one will die instantly. But knight d8. So this is actually a fascinating move. Jan, with this move, is trying to get to the middle and trade off against this knight and also play c6. So he actually wants to completely mimic the pawn structure of white. Now, this pawn structure... when I say pawn structure, that might be confusing to you. It might just be a buzzword you hear in videos like, I understand. Like, you know, you're just watching like, yeah, totes. I'm totally not going to go play a chess game after this and hang my queen. So pawn structure, you start to look at like which pawns are missing from both sides. Right now, everybody has pawns except E-file pawns, right? So it's like an exchange French. It's like we had a French defense like this, and then ED. So we just traded on d5, right? And then like chess got played. And this also happens in the Berlin defense, but a little bit more rare. Knight f3, queen e2 takes, and a couple, you know, just natural developing moves. Castles. I don't really need to go into depth. Bishop d3. So Magnus moves the bishop again, just like that pawn moved the second time. And this is kind of what Jan was happy to achieve from this opening. He doesn't have any disadvantages. His pawn is standing just as comfortably as white's pawn is. Now, just so you understand, the pawns are virtually frozen. And what I mean by that is you're not going to get things like g5 anymore. So just like, for example, if you were to play g5, this would be a completely unnecessary weakening of your structure. White will then win the corresponding battle on the light squares. And because your pawns are now targets, white always can play moves like h4 in the future, softening up your position. So in a position of basically total symmetry, we sometimes take this for granted because such really good players are playing. We don't really like expect certain moves. But when you have such dead symmetry, overextending with your pawns is a really bad decision. So what does that mean? Like, for example, c4 here, probably not recommended because this transformation of pawns leaves white with an isolated pawn because c and e got traded. And black will just play normal moves. I mean, black will then have just a pure target. So you have not transformed your position in a good way. It looks good. Oh, I have a bishop staring at f7, but okay, and? Are you ever going to attack it? The way you need to think about this is if you got 2-3 moves in a row, like how could you actually improve your position, right? So rook e1, I mean, Magnus goes to trade rooks. He does this because it's going to take Jan 2 turns and a third with the rook to get the rook in the game, and it'll take Magnus kind of an equal amount of time. We have knight e6, we have a trade, and we have g3. So what Magnus is trying to do here is put his knight on g2 and potentially trade this bishop. And the inherent kind of imbalance in this position is with the remaining pieces on the board. If you are not careful in a position like this, what white is going to do is slowly advance on this side. You plug this into any engine, it just tells you dead equal, both these guys are bozos, go back to sleep. But from a human standpoint, because this bishop doesn't get as involved in the game as the two white bishops, if you restrict it with pawns, white is always kind of the one trying to instigate here. And we see that with f3, you're now going to walk the king slowly forward. Anytime the rook has an open file, you just need to make sure it can't infiltrate. It can't. All those squares are mined. Not like Bitcoin, but, you know, like you can't step on it, you'll explode. So white will just kind of very slowly improve, probably trade off black's better bishop, which is the bishop on d6, and we are still waiting, you know, for this move. Also, if you simplify down to something like a bishop versus knight endgame, you might have some sort of advantage, and furthermore, white can just take some space. So you can just build some real estate on that side of the board, right? Like a4, a5, just trying to take as much space as possible without overcommitting. B4 is also okay, but when you play b4, you kind of weaken this, whereas if you play a4, you're not really weakening too much. So knight h5, fighting against f4, also very provocative move, because white can now play g4. G4 would be the critical test here, and if the knight comes back, here's just a situation where this position can get totally out of hand, like if black just plays a couple lazy moves. Now h4. And now black has almost no play, because you've stopped black's play like this. If black builds incorrectly on the structure, black is almost positionally losing. Like, very close. Because this bishop sucks. 6 of 7 black's pawns are in light squares, and with a light squared bishop, that's a death sentence. And this knight will try to get right there. So something like, bishop c2, knight d3, knight e5. Even if black is able to, like, try to trade off the knights, this position is still, like, torture. I mean, it's because the dark squares are so bad. So it's one thing to just yell, oh, this is just a draw. It's another thing to actually be precise. Magnus doesn't go for g4. I will show you why he doesn't go for g4. It happens later in the game. I don't want to spoil it in a sub-variation. Magnus plays king f2, and now he plays like this, and he kind of achieves everything we talked about, and he is ready to play the move h4, but Jan plays a very timely move, which is g5. And the knight would love to go to h5 if possible, but you can't, and you do not want to double your h-pawns and isolate them. That's just completely idiotic. And g5 is smart, because if you take, then after knight e6, knight f4, the knight lives forever. I mean, I guess you can play rook e1, and then if knight f4, rook takes rook, but then there's like king f8, I mean, there's h6 first, because if you play king f8 and blunder a full pawn like this, I mean, I don't think that's going to happen. We've seen some blunders in this world championship, but you need to play h6. So why is he giving away the knight for the bishop? I always talk about this. You never want to give away a bishop for a knight unless you have a good reason. The good reason here is dominant control of the dark squares. A bishop like this can only fight on 32 squares. A knight can fight on all 64. So in certain positions, as long as the knight can get back into the game, you're very happy. If this was the position, maybe you're not so happy, because the knight can't actually get to f4. This bishop could be better for the long-term prospects, because it's a much faster piece than the knight in terms of getting around the board. However, Magnus goes back to e2. Jan now plays f5 and actually begins to be a little bit more active. So he kind of justifies his knight in his bishop position. And a few moves later, Magnus thought for a bit, and he lit a grenade, he dropped it in the playing room, and he ran away. That's not actually what he did. That is very illegal. But he explodes the pawns, and the pawns come flying off the board. Jan has to take in the right way. For example, if you take on f4, this just gives white absolutely unnecessary help. And then if like something like f takes g4, then you just simply lose immediately. Which is exactly how I would expect some Guess the Elo games to go. Like, oh man, I was so close, and then I just blundered all my pieces. That's usually how chess goes. But we have f takes g4. Now we have h takes g4, bishop takes g4, rook takes h6, and now we have bishop f5. Again, bishop takes e2 looks decent, but it's not checkers. I would go here, and you would lose your rook, and then your bishop, and then you would cry. So we would bishop f5. We have a trade. We have a very temporary Magnus Carlsen pawn advantage, which dissipates immediately. And several moves later, as Jan runs his king, by the way, this is a very intelligent kind of reroute with the king. You need to go back to where the action is going to happen. Even if in the middle of a game like this, you walk your king, that's completely fine as long as there's no blunders. And you have to prevent rook f7, rook d7 mate. He does that by checking. Just in time, checks the king, forces a trade of rooks, and on move 41, the players agree to a draw. And with this, Magnus Carlsen takes a 6.5 to 3.5 lead after 10 games. Tomorrow we have another day of rest. And now Magnus needs 1 point out of the remaining 4 games. And Jan needs to get 3.5 to force a tiebreak. Is it over? It's looking like it is. This would single-handedly be the greatest run in chess history if Jan forced the rapid tiebreak. But I'm still hoping for him to get a win. Like, I want him to at least get one win before the classical games are done. But now Magnus is one win away from clinching the world championship. And if Jan pushes too hard with the white pieces in game 11 because he's trying to play for a win, giving Magnus winning chances, Magnus might win it in the very next game. That could be the final game. So, yeah, that's all for today. Pretty short game, not too eventful. Finished before 10 a.m. Actually, before like 9:40 New York time. So I'm gonna go have some breakfast. And I hope you have a fantastic rest of your Wednesday. And I'll see you for game 10. Get out of here.